Hi everyone, and welcome back to Vanished Memories, a channel specifically dedicated to getting out lesser known true crime and missing persons cases. If you are interested in this type of content, please do subscribe as I put out new videos every Wednesday. My name is Brianna, and today I will be sharing with you the case of 55-year-old Linda Muegge, who was unfortunately murdered in her home on May 14th of 2007. Her case remains unsolved to this day, and no killer has been brought to justice. Before I fully get into this case, I do just want to give a few content or trigger warnings regarding the material I'm about to cover. I will be mentioning the use of firearms, as well as the topic of sexual assault, though that will not be graphic in detail. I also will be mentioning the topic of animals being killed, and I will be describing the crime scene in this case in some detail. Viewer discretion is, of course, advised. Linda was born as Linda Ann Rising on September 21st of 1951 in Buffalo, New York. It seems as though at the time of Linda's birth, her mother's name was Louise Rising, though I was unable to get information about Linda's biological father. However, I do know that about 7 years after Linda's birth in 1958, Louise Rising, Linda's mother, would marry a man named James Watts. Louise would then take the last name Watts, so I will be referring to her as Louise Watts throughout this video. Linda would grow up with 2 siblings as far as I could find. Linda had a brother named Jason, though he's really not talked about much, and she does have a sister named Shannon who will come up quite frequently in this case. There really wasn't much information about Linda's upbringing and childhood, but she was described by her sister as a very opinionated person. According to Shannon, her sister, Linda was a very strong person, had a strong personality, and had a strong sense of what's right and what's wrong. Shannon would say that her and her sister often had ups and downs, but they were becoming closer as they were getting older in age. Though, unfortunately, that opportunity for them to grow even closer would be ripped away from them. Linda, at some point in her life, would meet a man named Fred Muegge Jr., and eventually they would get married, and Linda Rising would turn into Linda Muegge. So from now on, I will be referring to Linda as Linda Muegge. I was unable to find exactly when and where the two met, but I was able to find that they did divorce in 2005, and they were together for 30 years prior to that divorce. So I'm assuming they at least got married sometime in 1975, though I'm not sure when they met or how long they were together before they got married. However, at the time of their marriage, Linda would have been about 24, and Fred would have been about 28. We really do not know that much about Fred, but what we do know is that he was born in Houston, Texas on September 27th of 1947. After graduating high school, Fred would then enlist in the Navy and serve in the Vietnam War. He would be described as friendly, loving, compassionate, and he was a very gifted woodworker as well as furniture maker. So, like I said, we do not know the circumstances in which Fred and Linda met, but we do know the circumstances in which brought them to Fredericksburg, Texas. At some point during their relationship, Fred and Linda would be living in New Mexico. During this period of their life, they would make a trip back to Houston, Texas, presumably to see some of Fred's family or just for a short vacation. On their trip to Houston, Texas, they would pass through Fredericksburg, Texas, where they would see an ad in the local newspaper for a caregiver position. While traveling back to their home in New Mexico, they would decide to call the person who had made this ad to see if they could find employment with them. And subsequently, both of them would soon become caretakers for the Harris couple who were living in Fredericksburg. Due to this, Fred and Linda would relocate to that area. From what I can tell, this move for them happened around 1991, and according to a newspaper article that was published after this case happened, it does seem as though they had lived with the Harris family for about 4 to 5 years before moving into their own place. While working with the Harris family as their caretaker, Linda would actually befriend their daughter, Joni Harris. And Joni and Linda would become friends until, unfortunately, Linda was killed in 2007. Eventually, as I mentioned, the couple, Fred and Linda, would move out of the Harris home and into their own place on 506 Franklin Street. If we follow the timeline, I believe that this would have been around 1995 or 1996. I'm unsure how long the couple were working as caregivers for the Harris family, or if they were still doing so after moving out of their residence, but I do know that at the time of Linda's death, she was no longer working for them. Linda did work a few different jobs while she was residing in Fredericksburg, Texas, and I was able to find that at one point she worked as a Montessori school teacher, and at another point she did work at a title company within the town. About a decade after they moved into their home on Franklin Street, Fred and Linda would file for divorce. There's really not much information out there about why the couple chose to get a divorce, but it does seem that this split was amicable. After divorcing, Fred would move from the home on Franklin Street and leave the house to Linda. Regardless of the divorce, Linda pushed through and would carry on her life as normal. Linda enjoyed hobbies such as dancing and caring for her horses and sheep. Linda would also become the owner of a catering business that she called the Peasant Kitchen, which seemed to be rather popular at the time and people seemed to enjoy ordering from it. Now, I'm not sure when Linda exactly started this business or how long it had been running for, but what I do know is that she took the business very seriously. She kept a pretty strict regimen and routine for this business, which may not sound very important, but it will come into play a little bit later. Linda would send out menu choices about a month in advance prior to customers placing orders through her. It was well known by Linda's customers and friends that her cooking days were on Monday, and the following day, so Tuesday, her customers would come to pick up the food that they had ordered. Again, do keep this information in mind as we go through this case. Like I said, Linda was a very professional woman when it came to her catering business, but it was known that she still was a very generous and compassionate person. She would often hand out food to the sick, elderly, or just anyone in need of a meal for free. So now, let's get into the preceding year before Linda's death and what was going on in her life at the time. A little less than a year before her death, Linda would start to date a man named James Frederick. It seemed as though this happened in the summer of 2006, according to one of Linda's friends that she had met around that same time. Linda's friend, Jamie Morris, would meet her in the summer of 2006 in a yoga class where they both attended. Shortly after meeting Jamie, Linda and her boyfriend James would often meet up with Jamie and her husband Jim to go to a local bar and restaurant called Honcho's. There, they would drink, dance, and play games. Jamie would eventually recount them all becoming fast friends, and eventually the four of them would actually be known as the founding members of a group called the Hondo's Irregulars. These seemed to be people that often hung out at Hondo's, and eventually it would grow to way more than just the four of them. Reportedly, there would be about 40 people at one point. So now that we know the circumstances surrounding Linda's last year of life, let's talk about the specific circumstances that led to her death. The night before Linda's death, so on May 13th of 2007, I was able to find that Linda had gone fly fishing. It seems as though this was a solo trip, as I was able to find a recount from Linda's friend Joni, who actually had seen her on her way back, and they shared a very brief conversation. From what I could tell from Joni's statement, there was no one else involved in this trip with Linda. After Linda and Joni had a brief conversation with each other, they would part ways and go back to their homes. But what Joni didn't know is that this is the last time she would see her friend alive. So now, let's get into the actual events on the day of May 14th, 2007. It seems as though this day was relatively normal for Linda, and it's likely that she would have gone out throughout the day and ran some errands. What we do know about that day for certain is that Linda had attended a yoga class, and that class was actually with her friend Jamie Morris. Jamie would recall walking out of the yoga class with her friend Linda at approximately 5:30 p.m. that night. According to her and Linda would talk for a short while, but eventually Linda would go home saying that she needed to start cooking for the night. Remember, this would have been a Monday, so this does align with her normal routine. So Linda would go home that night after her yoga class with the intention of cooking meals for her customers to pick up the next day. But unfortunately, about 2.5 hours later, Linda's house would be set ablaze with Linda still inside. It would be between 7:58 and 7:59 p.m. on the night of May 14th when passers-by near Linda's house would notice smoke and flames coming from her home. Several of these people would contact the Fredericksburg Volunteer Fire Department, and others would attempt to get inside the home from several different points in order to help anyone who may be inside. However, they were unable to do so considering the severity of the smoke and the flames that were engulfing Linda's home. These people were unsuccessful in gaining access to Linda's home due to the severity of both the smoke and the flames, but what they didn't know was that Linda was actually already deceased inside the house. The fire department would be able to get to Linda's house in only 2 minutes. The fire department would normally have taken approximately 5 to 6 minutes to respond to Linda's address, but fortunately they were actually able to do so in 2 minutes due to the fact that they were running a practice fire drill about 5 blocks away at a nearby hotel. Altogether, 28 firefighters would be sent to Linda's address on Franklin Street. A portion of them would stay in the front of the house with their water hoses aimed at the fire in order to attempt to put it out, while the other portion would enter through the rear of the house in order to see if anyone was still in there and alive. They would, of course, enter with protective gear as well as oxygen packs, but unfortunately, Linda, like I said, was already deceased at this point. It would take the fire department approximately 5 hours in order to put out the fire at 506 Franklin Street that night. Remember, they started fighting the fire at approximately 8 p.m., and the last truck that they had sent out in order to fight this fire didn't return back to the station until approximately 12:40 p.m. During the course of time in which the firefighters would be attempting to subdue the fire and put it out, they would eventually realize that Linda was inside and already deceased. Now, one would expect the victim of a structure fire to have died as a result of the fire, either through burns or smoke inhalation. But instead, it was found that Linda had actually already been murdered before the fire had even started. Linda would be found by firefighters. However, she was already deceased, as I said, lying on her stomach under debris which had fallen from the ceiling. Linda would be found with her underwear pulled down to her knees. However, a future autopsy on her body would conclude that there was actually no signs of sexual assault. What this autopsy would reveal, however, is that Linda had died as a result of several different injuries. Not only did she suffer sharp and blunt force injuries to both her head and her neck, but she also showed signs of strangulation as well as smothering. Knowing that Linda was murdered, her home on Franklin Street would eventually become a crime scene. 2 days after the fire on May 16th, the Texas Department of Public Safety Crime Laboratory Unit will be sent to process this scene. During the course of this investigation and the processing of this scene, a knife would eventually be found in what was left of the living room. Eventually, it would be discovered that Linda's phone and wallet was likely taken by whoever had killed her, considering that these 2 items had never been found. However, a large sum of money was still found within Linda's home, so it seems as though robbery was not the motive for whoever had killed Linda that night. I also do want to mention that in one report, it was said that during this investigation, a rifle was found in one of the closets in Linda's home, but it seems as though this was not correlated at all to her murder. Linda did not have any gunshot wounds, and this may have been her personal weapon, but I did just want to mention that. The day after the crime scene investigation, so on March 17th, the Texas State Fire Marshal's office would enter the home on Franklin Street in order to conduct a fire investigation. As you might be able to guess, this fire was concluded to be a result of arson. Whoever had killed Linda reportedly had doused her home and her body in accelerant. It seems as though this fire was actually started in the living room of the home, where, if you remember, the knife was found. In the aftermath of this case, Linda's family would recall getting the news of their loved one's death. Her sister, Shannon, had said that she was absolutely devastated when she learned the news. She would go on to say, "I hit the floor on my knees and I swear I was gone." Her mother, Louise, would say, "For days, I couldn't believe it." Linda's friend, Jamie, the one that she had attended that yoga class with that night, had said that she did not learn about Linda's death until the morning after. This was because she had shut her phone off when she went home and did not turn it off until the next morning. When she would eventually turn on her phone that morning, she would get the news about her friend's death through messages on the yoga instructor's website. Jamie would go on to say that at first, people believed that this was an accident. According to her, there was one theory that Linda's stove could have blown up, and I guess this could make sense given the fact that it was known that she was cooking for her catering business that night. However, as we know, this was not the case. Shortly after the news of Linda's death, Jamie and her husband Jim would decide to go over to Linda's boyfriend, James's house, in order to help him and provide comfort. They would say that he was in a state that day and he never really recovered from the death of his girlfriend. He would sadly pass away on February 22nd of 2009, about 2 years after Linda had been killed. Much of the community would mourn Linda's death, including the rest of the Hondo's Irregulars group that Linda had a hand in forming. According to some sources, the Hondo's Irregular group had decided to get together in order to grieve and have a celebration of life for Linda. While Linda's community, family, and friends were grieving her loss, the Fredericksburg Police Department were attempting to get some answers. They wanted to get some clarity and understanding of the circumstances that led up to Linda's death, as well as who could have been responsible for it. The police eventually would come up with their own theories and persons of interest in this case, but they eventually decided to get help from a few different agencies. These were the Behavioral Analysis Unit of the FBI located in Quantico, Virginia, as well as the Walter Reed Military Hospital located in Bethesda, Maryland. The Fredericksburg Police Department would actually have a full-day consultation with these two entities, wherein they would discuss their theories, persons of interest, as well as the crime scene and an overview of Linda's life. In response, authorities in the FBI would state that they believed that the Fredericksburg was right on target. They believed that they would be close to solving her murder. Unfortunately, though, even though the Fredericksburg Police Department were able to get some extra information and insight into this case would still remain unsolved. To this day, almost 2 decades later, Linda's killer has not been caught, and her case remains cold. So now that we know the immediate investigatory aftermath of this case, let's get into some of the theories surrounding it. Before I fully get into these theories, though, I do just want to briefly talk about 2 events that happened in Linda's life leading up to her death. These events would become public only after her death, which is why I'm choosing to include them here now instead of in chronological order. Also, I feel like the information that I'm about to present to you didn't really fit anywhere else within this case, and it makes more sense to put it right before the theories that I'll talk about today. The first event that we'll talk about happened on September 3rd of 2003, so about 4 years before Linda's death. There was a report made to police on that day wherein she said that she felt uncomfortable and unsafe on her property due to the fact that there was a man named Frank, who was a white male in his 50s, that had followed her onto it. According to her, Frank was introduced to her through a friend, but she did not feel comfortable having him on the property. Unfortunately, I was unable to determine if anything came out of this report. I could not find if police responded or if there was any action done by the police, but it seems as though nothing else happened with this man who she referred to as Frank. Do be aware of the fact that this was during 2003, so Linda still would have been married to her husband Fred, so I'm not sure if he could have had a hand in helping to remove Frank from the property. However, like I said, no more reports were made by Linda and nothing else seemed to come from it. There is another incident that happened to Linda about a year before her death, which I think is noteworthy. This incident would occur on February 12th of 2006. Be aware that what I'm about to tell you is going to involve the death of animals. So on that day, Linda will report that she had found her 2 bottle-fed sheep shot to death. I am not sure when she discovered this, whether she had witnessed it or had just heard it and came out, but what we do know is that someone had deliberately shot her sheep. Police would eventually be able to determine that the sheep were shot with a rifle that was .22 caliber. However, there was no other information garnered about this. We still don't know the perpetrator of this act. Now, let's get into the actual theories. I do just want to preface this section by saying that a lot of the information I'm going to share with you is a little bit more speculative than it is factual, but I thought it was important to present either way. All these theories that I'm about to present are at the end of the day just that, theories, so please listen to this information with that in mind. The first theory is that her ex-husband Fred had something to do with her death. If we recall, they had only been divorced for about 2 years prior to Linda's murder. According to police, the evidence in this case continually led back to Fred Muegge. Fred actually did have kind of an alibi for the night of Linda's death. It was reported that he said that he was at a yoga class that night in Austin, Texas. Be mindful that this, of course, was not the same one that Linda was at, but according to him, he attended that class that night, at the same time where Linda was murdered. Police did check into this and found that Fred's credit card was used at that yoga class that night. However, it seems as though there was no CCTV footage within the building or in the yoga class, so it was not confirmed whether Fred actually was the one to swipe his card that night. So even though Fred had an alibi of sorts, he was not 100% cleared. Police would go on to explain that Fred had actually failed 2 polygraph tests and his DNA was found at the scene of the crime. However, just for the sake of this theory, I want to play devil's advocate for just a few minutes, so bear with me here. So let's start with the polygraph tests and the fact that Fred had allegedly failed 2 of them. First off, if you don't know, polygraphs are actually inadmissible in most courts in the United States. Only about 1/3 of states within the United States allows polygraphs to be used within their courts as evidence, and a handful of those states actually only allow it if both parties at trial agree to the polygraph's admissibility. Now, why is this? It's because polygraphs are actually notoriously unreliable and inaccurate. It truthfully depends on who you speak to and what sources you follow, but according to a lot of scientific and government bodies, they generally agree that a lot of polygraph tests can be inaccurate and misconstrued. Though there are some claims of polygraph tests being between 80 and 90% accurate by those who advocate for them, other research suggests that they're not very accurate at all and actually very ineffective. Some people actually believe that the accuracy of a polygraph test can be as low as 50%. This is because polygraphs work by monitoring physiological changes within the body. That means that it takes things like heart rate, blood pressure, perspiration, and respiration into account. This was created under the presumption that if someone was being deceitful, their body would show responses of that. But if you think about it, not everyone will show the same signs of being nervous. Some people can act completely normal to others, even if they are lying or being deceitful on a polygraph test. As well, some people can just be very nervous and be perceived as a liar during a polygraph test, even though it's just due to their nerves. It would, of course, be extremely nerve-wracking for quite a lot of people to be strapped to a machine and put on the spot and ask questions in front of police and a polygraph examiner. Combine those nerves with the grief that someone might be feeling after discovering that their loved one has been brutally murdered, and yeah, you might get an inaccurate result. I'm not saying necessarily that Fred's 2 tests were inaccurate. It could have been that he is lying. However, I think it's important to take into account the fact that polygraphs are, first of all, not admissible in court, so they don't really mean anything in the eyes of the law, and they're historically inaccurate. They're inaccurate even currently in 2026, but consider the fact that these tests were given to Fred almost 2 decades ago as well. So now that we've talked about the polygraphs, let's move on to the fact that Fred's DNA was allegedly found at the scene. There's a few points that I do think are actually worth being brought up regarding this evidence. There are actually no more specifics on this physical evidence other than the fact that it was found at the scene. It does not mention what type of DNA this is either. There are actually a few different types of DNA evidence. There's touch DNA, which can happen when your skin cells transfer to an object, and there's also other types of DNA that can be found in things like hair or bodily fluids. Such bodily fluids could be seminal fluid, urine, sweat, or blood. However, again, we don't know what DNA of Fred's was actually found at the scene. So this lack of evidence makes me wonder a few things. That is, what state was the DNA evidence in? How close of a match was it to Fred's DNA? And was this DNA evidence at all degraded? Remember, this scene was not only a homicide, but also an arson fire. Intense heat, like what would have come from an arson fire that had burned for 5 hours, would definitely degrade a lot of DNA evidence. It can break down the molecular bonds within the DNA, which would cause chemical and fragmentation changes. This, of course, would make the DNA analysis different. Not only is it odd that the police department would be able to collect this DNA evidence at an arson scene and be able to positively identify it, but I'd also be so curious to know as to where exactly they found this evidence. So I actually interned at a police department for about 6 months during my college career, and I was working in the CSI unit, or the crime scene investigation unit. When we would arrive at death investigation scenes, the protocol for evidence collection often meant that we were confined to the area where the person was found deceased. Normally, we would not be collecting evidence from all over the house. However, I do just want to point out that I actually didn't go on any arson investigations, and I was not a part of many homicide investigations, and also I live in New York, but this case took place in Texas, so their laws and evidentiary procedures could be different. That's all to say, it still does make me kind of curious as to how far the investigative team would have had to branch out from the scene of Linda's body in order to collect DNA evidence that was obtainable as well as identifiable. I would assume that since the accelerant was poured both over Linda's body as well as around her and around the house, those areas would be the most burned and would be the hardest to get DNA evidence from. So what evidence would they have gotten that was close enough to Linda in order for them to actually be able to make an identification and make him as person of interest? Was Fred's DNA actually found close enough to Linda's body for it to be considered suspicious? Or was his DNA found outside of the main crime scene? We do know that Fred and Linda had been divorced for about 2 years at this point, but we don't know exactly how long Fred had actually been out of the house for. After all, Fred and Linda were married for 30 years, and the divorce seemed relatively amicable, so it could have been possible for them to have remained friends and for Fred to have come over at some point. Even then, it could seem suspicious for Fred's DNA to still be in there depending on when he was last at the residence. However, it is important to note that DNA can stay on certain surfaces for a very long time. DNA can actually stay on certain surfaces for anywhere from days to even years, depending on the material that surface is. With that being said, like I said, it'd be very important to know where this DNA evidence was found, whether it was a common area in the house or somewhere else. So as you can see with the things I mentioned about the DNA evidence as well as the polygraph evidence, there are some things to disprove this theory. Even if it is unfortunately common for spouses or ex-spouses to be perpetrators of violent acts or deadly acts like this, I think it's important to realize that this theory isn't necessarily fully fleshed out. I also want to end this theory with one more bit of information, and that is that Linda's family doesn't seem to be big proponents of this theory and believe that Fred wouldn't have hurt Linda. I think this honestly speaks volumes when you consider the fact that the family had known Fred for over 3 decades at this point. Linda's sister, Shannon, was quoted as saying, "Some days I think he might have, and other days I just know in my heart that he didn't." Like I said, this does seem to be the lead theory in this case, though there's obviously wasn't enough evidence to charge Fred with anything to do with Linda's murder. Fred also did pass away about 6 years after this case on December 18th of 2013, which of course led this case to become cold and this theory to be at a standstill. So let's get into the second theory. Now this theory I actually haven't seen much on, but I do think that there's some ground to it, so I did want to share this theory with you guys. This theory is that either Frank, the man that Linda had reported in 2003, had something to do with her death, or the person who had shot both her sheep had something to do with it. This is all really speculation, but the man, Frank, who Linda had reported obviously made her uncomfortable or fearful enough to do so. So the question is, could this man have done something? But also, if so, why would he choose to do so 4 years after the police report was filed? Like I said before, we really don't have any more information on anything else that happened between Linda and Frank after this, so it seems as though this was a one-off thing. Additionally, we don't really have information on who Frank actually is, but Linda had reported to the police that day that Frank was known to her through a friend. So you would think that at this point, if Frank really did have something to do with it, the police would have been able to identify him and question him. But like I said, there really has been no movement on this part of the theory. I also think that it's notable that at this point, Frank has never been actually identified. So I'm assuming that if police actually thought that Frank did have some involvement, they would have been able to contact Linda's friends or figure out who he was through some means. Because of this, I think that the Frank theory is kind of far-fetched, considering that it seems as though the instance where Linda called the cops was a one-time thing, and it seems nothing else occurred between them between 2003 and the time that she was murdered in 2007. However, then we get to the sheep incident. Now, this happened, of course, closer to her death, about a year prior to it. So, was it related to her death? And if so, why? If someone had truly wanted to do something to Linda in 2006, why would they instead choose to shoot her sheep? And why would they choose to do that and then do nothing for a year until they murdered her in 2007? Like I said, I know that these theories are a little far-fetched, but I thought that it was important enough to bring up again, just due to the fact that these instances did happen before Linda's death. And of course, these instances are very odd. In the aftermath of this case, Linda's sister Shannon would actually take over the property at 506 Franklin Street. Now, Linda's actual residence was deemed a total loss, so Shannon would actually have to destroy the rest of the property, but she would rebuild her home on the same property where her sister had lived. It seems as though Shannon lived on the property with her husband until 2018, when I found that it was listed for sale. According to an interview in 2024, Shannon now resides with her husband in Waco, Texas. I also want to mention that Linda's mother, Louise, was also living in Texas City by 2024. In 2024, Linda's mother would participate in an interview, and at the time she was 99 years old. She would state that her daughter's death is something that she'll never get over and never forget. She would go on to say that she believes that not getting answers for why her daughter was murdered or who had done it was the reason that she believed that she was still hanging on to life. She would state, Maybe that's why I'm hanging on to 100. Maybe 101, maybe 102. Louise would hit her 100th birthday on May 5th of 2024, though unfortunately she would pass away a few months before her 101st birthday on January 22nd of last year, 2025. Unfortunately, she passed away not knowing who had killed her daughter Linda. With all that being said, the murder of 55-year-old Linda Muegge still remains unsolved to this day. There have been some tips and leads in the case, though unfortunately none have resulted in anything substantial enough to lead to clarity or conclusion in the case. There have been a few different monetary rewards that were offered for information in this case. Those have ranged from $1,000 all the way up to $16,000. Currently, from what I can see, there is a reward for $3,000 still available right now for any information that could lead to the person responsible for Linda's death. Regardless of the monetary reward involved, if you or anyone you know have any information regarding Linda's case, please reach out to the proper authorities. The agency still handling this case is the Fredericksburg Police Department, though information can be given through tips through the Gillespie County Crime Stoppers or the Texas Crime Stoppers. As always, I will have those numbers on screen as well as in the description box below for you. This concludes the unsolved death of Linda Muegge, a 55-year-old woman who was murdered in her home on May 14th of 2007. It has been 2 decades since her death, but unfortunately her case still remains cold. Thank you once again for tuning in to hear about Linda Muegge's case. If you enjoyed learning about this case or found it educational, please don't hesitate to leave a like, comment, subscribe, or share this video. Again, my name is Brianna, and thank you so much for joining me on this episode of Vanished Memories. Bye!